Okay, thank you, Matt. As Ruth has already mentioned, I'm going to take you through some of the scenarios. We basically kind of used this as a way of stepping through all the different elements in the curriculum model when we were doing some of the review activity with it. We found after you've done a little bit of the beginning bit, looked at the theory, actually it helped kind of click everything into place, you know, when we go through these different examples. So I will step through some of these. Some of these are very simple, some of them are a little bit more complicated. Okay, so
Rachel, just before you start,
yep, go on.
a question's just come through. Is there a relationship between module HECOS codes and course level HECOS codes?
Not a direct. Yeah, go on, Ruth.
Thanks, Ruth.
No, I think I was about to say what you were about to say. Not a direct link, because again, as I said, we know that the students might take elective modules or do a module that's not quite aligned with their qualification codes. I suspect that what we'll want to do is some validation to make sure that it's not miles out. They'll have to speak to the analyst to see what their plans are for that, but there's not a direct link between them. We'd obviously expect there to be some similarity in a lot of cases, but there could be the odd module that's quite different to the qualification subject in some cases.
Thanks so much, Ruth. Sorry to interrupt you, Rachel.
No, that's right. Okay, was there any other questions? I'm actually carry on.
No, that was it. You can carry on.
Yep.
Thank you.
As I said, we've got a couple of simple examples to start with, and a couple of, well, quite a few more complicated ones as we go through this. So looking at a general full-time students doing a pretty standard kind of pattern of study, studying for 3 years, not taking any breaks and learning, not doing anything particularly special in that in the middle. So on this one, we've got a course, they're doing a maths degree, they're doing a first degree, so it's an undergraduate course. You can see here, I've got 3 different students drawn up. So I've got Di, Mitch and Vicky. So Di is doing a typical kind of start in September. And so she's going to have 3 student course sessions, which reflect one for each of the years that she's doing. And then attached to that, she'll have 3 session years. So in this diagram, you can see session years A, B, and C reflect Di's years. And you can see the blue student course sessions at the top reflect her 1, 2, and 3 years. You then have a student who might be starting in January, so doing a kind of January to December. So Mitch in this example is doing that, so he's doing his 3 years. So he is then linked to 3 different session years, so G, H, and I on this slide, doing from January to December. We've also got Vicky as well, just to put in all of the reference period years. So we've got her starting in April and ending in May. And so she, again, has 3 different session years, J, K, and L. So what this also shows you is some of the start dates around the student course session and session year. So session year has to be 12 months long. That's why that session year bucket is there. It's to put that year, that 12-month bucket around the student study so you can kind of see what they're doing. So in Di's example, her student course session end date actually ends in June, but she's linked to a session year that ends in August. That's fine because she's obviously got a summer break in her study pattern. She's not doing anything between June and August. And so the student course session reflects the dates that she's actually studying, what she's actually doing, and the session year is just attaching her to 12 months bucket. So that means in her second year, she isn't starting studying until September again. And so that's fine. If she was to do something in, say, August, then you'd need to put that study period at the end of her first year, so it was reflected in that session year kind of bucket. So that's a full-time student. Looking now at a part-time student. So Hayes, in this example, has got is studying about the same course, but she's studying about 50% kind of rate time-wise compared to a full-time student. So in her example, she's still got these session years. They're still starting around September to going from September to August. And her student course sessions are also, she's taking a summer break, so they're ending in June as well. starting in September. But she's got 6 of them because she's kind of spreading out her studying and she's doing it over a longer period of time. So moving on to a placement student. So one of the things that the session years does is that you can attach it to any type of study a student is doing. So in this example, we've got Hayes in here as well, just as for context. Ruth is doing a placement year. So in years 1 and 2, they're attached to the same session years. And in year 3, which is marked here as Ruth's placement year, that can also be attached to the same session year C that Hayes is actually studying at the provider, because it doesn't matter what they're actually doing in that year, it matters that they're against that time bucket. That's what's important for the session year. And then Ruth carries on and goes back to studying in her 4th year, so she's got another session year attached there. So the fact that she's doing a placement year in her 3rd year, that's kind of all taken care of as part of the student core session level data and other data items in there. So in terms of the curriculum side, that doesn't really matter in this instance. Similarly, with a foundation year, the fact that they're doing, so Charlie in this example is doing a foundation year as the 1st year, that can still be attached to the same session year bucket as someone doing their 1st year. I've got a little note on here to remind me to tell you that the year of programme is still going to be 0 now for this foundation year. We've had lots of discussions about this and providers are very unhappy that we changed it, that it had to be from 1, but actually once we'd kind of gone through all of these examples, we decided that it was okay to continue having that as year programme 0. So as with the Ruth's placement example, Charlie just carries on studying and you can link them to the same session year depending on what's relevant to what he's studying. So I'm going to pause slightly there. Are there any questions on the first 4 examples? Because they're the slightly more simple examples.
That was perfectly timed. Questions just come in.
Oh.
So the question is, what happens if the placement year is technically over a year or starts before the end of the session year that had year 2 in it, e.g. from July 2022 to September 2023?
Yes, so we've carried forward similar guidance to what we've got now around mobility. So if they are very slightly over, I think, is it 4 weeks? I think we've decided on guidance. I can double check that. Then it's okay to attach it to that, the student core session that's got the bulk of the study. But if it's any longer than that, then they will have to break it up so that it fits against the student core session. This example then, this is a late starter. So this is me starting late on my course. What this is demonstrating is why the session year is really helpful to have. So Di is doing the normal course, doing years 1, 2 and 3. And then I started a little bit late. So it's only a couple of weeks late. I've not got too far behind. But what the provider can do is then reflect the fact I don't start until October, but attach me to the same session year as Di, because we're studying the same thing. I've just caught up, maybe I've missed the first couple of weeks, but I'm catching up. I'm going to do that work to catch up. So I am effectively studying the same thing and then carrying on in years 2 and 3, the same as everyone else. So this kind of highlights to you that this date is different to all the other students starting, and it's different to the start of the session year. If I start late and actually I'm doing a whole different course, then you would need to put, like the very first example, you'd need to put me on a different session year to show that I am doing a different kind of pattern of study to Di or whoever it was in the example. But it's only when they're definitely catching up and they're doing the same thing as everyone else, you can put them on the same session year. So there we go, that's what I just said. So it indicates the plan of what the student should have done, and then the student core session indicates what's actually happened with that student. So postgraduate research student. So as Ruth has mentioned, there is no session year for PGR students. So their student core sessions are where the 12-month period has to come into play. So in this example, we've got what are probably not years in PGR terms, but years 1, 2, 3 and 4 for Jean on this. She changes to writing it later on, but that's fine for the curriculum. You identify that at the student level. So here, her buckets do have to go from September to August. So they do have to be 12 months long. There's no session year for them to attach the bucket to. Sorry, to attach to a bucket. But we understand that that is actually better for providers because there doesn't tend to be a kind of standard period of study for PGR students. And so they would probably have ended up doing this anyway. So that's the difference with PGR. So now I'm going to go into a couple of dormancy scenarios. So these are where it gets a little bit more complicated, but having that session year kind of helps you identify what the student's doing and where they're moving around. So what I've done really quickly is draw out in boxes rather than the actual field names what the student is doing, just so that you can help kind of follow where I'm going with this. So Emily's going to start her course in year 1. Everything goes fine for Emily in year 1. She's then going to, in her second year, she's gone dormant for whatever reason. She then decides to come back a year later, and she moves on to the next cohort of students because she's skipped a whole year of study. She comes back in and joins kind of the next cohort of students and carries on with year 2 and then carries on with year 3 fine. So it's this bit in the middle that she's dormant for a whole year and isn't actually studying at the provider. So drawing that out in terms of the actual boxes of the fields and entities. So she's studying her course like everyone else. She's got student course sessions like everyone else, and she's attached to the relevant session years here. But what happens at the end of her first year is the provider knew that she wasn't coming back. So she is marked as ending here. And then in this second year where she's actually dormant, at some point you tell us that she's gone dormant, and then you don't need to return her again until she actually comes back. So there are a few ways of doing this. Either you kind of say at the end of this student course session, yes, I know the student is coming back. It's not coming back, sorry. It's not coming back next year, and so I won't be returning them. Or if you didn't know and then the provider found out, when she doesn't come back in September, you could return this again and say, no, she's definitely gone. I won't go into too much detail about dormancy. We've got a whole kind of guidance document stepping through all the different examples, but that's how it's kind of reflected in terms of the curriculum data. And so then she carries on studying, and that's kind of all appears as normal. So I've mapped in this session year here because if you did have to return her in year 2, in the second year to tell us she'd gone dormant, then you would still attach her to a session year. So that's a whole year going dormant. We then have a kind of a different length of course. So providers were saying to us that actually, 1 year doesn't necessarily mean 12 months. So particularly things like medical courses or H&C in this example, they might do a 6-month and a 12-month. And that's that doesn't work with a session year. So you do still, the point of this slide is to basically say you do still have to break it up. And even if you think it's kind of a 6 months and a 12 months, that doesn't work in the way we've set it up. So they will have to break it down into the first 12 months and then carry on breaking it down into 12 months blocks, depending on how long they're studying for. So yeah, we know it might not quite fit for some, but unfortunately, the one scenario isn't going to be perfect for absolutely everyone. And in this one, at least, they're breaking it down in the same way as the other students they're returning. So fully flexible. Again, like the PGR ones, don't need a session year for them. So they've only got student course sessions. They will be flagging up at the course level here that they are a fully flexible student. So we will know not to expect session years for them. And you just attach them like other students. So in here we've got Andy's student and Joe is a student. They started at different times. Andy started in September and Joe started in January. So they've got different student course session dates. But again, as with the PGR ones, this is where the 12-month period has to be brought into account. So they do have to be 12 months long. Now I think I'm going to go on to, they're going to go on to slightly more complicated examples. So I'm going to pause there again. I'm about two-thirds of the way through the examples. Are there any questions? I'll give you a couple of minutes just to think about it.
There's a couple of questions that have come in already, Rachel, for you. So one of them, Eve, sorry, start again. Is there a difference if a student starts substantially late, e.g. in January, but still intends to catch up and study in the second and subsequent years on a September to July basis? So this is going back to your example 5, your late starter.
Yeah. Is there a difference? So I think the guidance we've written at the moment is, you know, if they're doing months and months later, that doesn't really sound like they're catching up, unless they're kind of, I don't know, can you do an accelerated course and then catch up for a little bit? So I think that would kind of depend on the example, the specific case, really. When we were doing the review sessions, and we asked the question to providers how long they give students before they would consider them a late starter and allow them to carry on. It was a matter of weeks. So that's how we kind of went for 2 weeks, because that seemed to be a good amount of time that most people had, or it was shorter than that. So I think at the moment the answer would be no. If it was significantly past that, we'd probably expect you to be on another course, but I am happy to be corrected or told that there is an example where that is the case.
That's great, thank you. I'll leave our colleague to ponder a response if there is one regarding that one. The other question that came in, and I know we've had conversations about this before, will session years be identified by labels or start end dates, or anything otherwise?
So I think Ruth had a slide where it said the fields on there. So there will be an ID on there. So providers can use whatever you know, makes the most sense for them. There's also an own ID on there, because that's really helpful for providers to have that. And there is a start and end date. So that's how we kind of identify them, really. There's nothing else on there.
Thank you. Okay. What if a student starts in January as they have some APAL modules and will then catch up?
I'm going to presume that's carrying on from the last question.
It's a different colleague, but
yes.
yeah, I guess it probably is.
Yeah, so there are a couple of fields where they identify that they are APAL, like they identify where that APAL is kind of coming from, which is on the entry profile, I think. And so, yes, I guess those could be examples where they're starting later. I think we might need to talk through the actual details of exactly what that example is later. So I suggest it's probably best if you email us about that one and we can have a chat about that. I think the idea was we didn't want really providers just attaching students to ones that didn't seem to make sense. So if they're starting quite a lot later, are they really doing it? Maybe they are. And, you know, in that example, maybe they've transferred from somewhere else and actually they brought in a whole load of credits with them. So, you know, as with the other things, there could be tolerances applied for that if that was allowed. But it's kind of the specific example I'd need really to work that one through.
Okay, thank you for that. If our colleague that's made that put that question through wants to talk about it, then by all means, if you want to send me another message, we can open up your microphone and make it more of a conversation at some point during the session. Other than that, there are no other questions at the moment, Rachel. Okay,
I will proceed with the final few complicated ones.
That's great, thank you.
Thank you. So now we're going to look at a research student. So in this example, it looks a little bit similar to the dormancy example in terms of these boxes. As again, I've tried to draw out the actual scenario, what's happening first. So Alice, in this example, she's starting off in her first year. She then, for whatever reason, I presume she's not passed her exams, then has to resit the whole of the first year. So she's studying and doing the exams. So she then probably moves on to a second cohort, so the one that started a year after she did. She resits that whole year, passes this time, and so carries on to years 2 and years 3 in her course. So in terms of the student course sessions and session years, so it looks quite similar to, well, a full-time student, I guess. She's starting off in year 1. She's then resitting year 2. And it would look like she's attached to the same buckets because all she's done is just deferred for a whole 12 months. And so she's still on the same kind of cadence, I guess, if you like, of session years. And then years 3 and years 4, she just carries on and again has those session years for the relevant years. So it doesn't look all that different in terms of the kind of the buckets of session years, but it's just knowing that this is her resit year and this is where it's attached, and you carry on attaching it in the same way if she's kind of resitting a whole year and it's a whole 12 months later. So the next one is a slightly more complicated resit. So this is a part year resit. So Sam, in this example, attends the whole of the first year. She then starts part of the second year and maybe fails her exam in December, perhaps, and then wants to restart that bit again and then carry on. At this provider, and I understand this doesn't happen at every provider, but in this example, there is a cohort of students starting in January. So she's able to join that cohort at the point she kind of stops in her first cohort in December. So she comes back in January, joins this other cohort, resits that beginning of the year 2, then carries on with the rest of year 2 and passes it the whole year, and then carries on with year 3. So what this example is showing is how you kind of use the cohorts, or it's going to be the session years, to kind of reflect how she's jumped around from the first September-August kind of cadence to the January-December cadence. So in terms of drawing that out, she's got the first year, she attends that as normal, and so she's attached to the session year A again. So she starts in year 2, so she's attached to the same session year B as a full-time student would be, but she actually stops in December because that's the point when she realises that she's say failed her exams and needs to resit that beginning of the year 2. And so what happens then is she comes back in January, but she's attached to the January-December session year. So if you think back to the very first full-time example, I had 3 students there, one starting in September, one starting in January, and one starting in April. And so she's basically moved from the September buckets to the January bucket. And so that shows to us that she's doing the whole year, because her dates are January to December. She's studying the whole year. And so we know that she's finished that year 2. And then she moves on to year 3, again, sticking with the January cohorts, and finishes off in year 3. So she finishes her studying in December 2022. So what this is doing is the session years are kind of showing what she is planning to do, what she might have done, but then she's interrupted this in this kind of second year to show that she's had to resit something, she's done something slightly different to normal students, and she's changed onto a different study pattern. So looking at something slightly different, transferring within provider. So in this example, a student has started on a physics degree, had started for a couple of weeks, say, and so they were attached to that relevant session year, and then realised that that study was not for them, and they wanted to transfer onto the maths degree. So there's a reason for student course session ending, that would be flagged as 03, which is transferred within provider, and that tells us that she's moving on to something else. And that means that she can have another student course session here that starts her maths degree. So like with the late starter, this is only a couple of weeks, and so it's all right to attach it to the session year. And so we've attached Hannah here to say that she's started a little bit late, but she's doing the same thing as everyone else. And then carry on years 2 and 3 as with everyone else. So now a couple of dormancy scenarios. So this is a whole year dormancy. So I have done a whole year before, I can't remember which number it is now, but that was kind of a year within the normal year pattern. What's happened here is Becky in this example, this period here, this is her year of dormancy, but it's actually staggered across kind of year 1 and year 2. So she started studying in September, she's got as far as December. Then when she comes back in January, something's happened and she's going to go dormant. Maybe she's gone dormant for a year, or maybe in the cases where providers don't have a January cohort for her to come back and kind of carry on with, and so she's told she's got to wait a year. So she's going to be dormant from studying for a year. Then when she comes back, she'll move to the next kind of year's cohort, so the 2020-23 cohort. And she only has to start halfway through because she's already done the first bit anyway. So she starts at the right point, finishes off year 1, then carries on with year 2 and year 3 as normal. The complicated factor here is simply that she's done it in the middle of the kind of 12-month period. So looking at what that actually looks like. So again, she starts off in September, is attached to the relevant session year. And then in the middle of that, so in December, it tells us that she has stopped. So reason student course session ending 02 is interrupted. So that tells us she's stopped studying. Then when she comes back, so she's not returned straight away because the provider has already told us she's gone dormant. So she doesn't need to be returned until she comes back, which, flicking back to the diagram, is in January 2021. So that's when she's next returned. She's finishing off the year. So she is attached to a bucket, which might look a bit weird because she's not starting from September. She's actually starting in the middle of this session year B. But that's okay because we know that's what she's done. And so she carries on for the rest of that year. And then in years, her year 2 and year 3 of study, it looks the same as everyone else, session year C and D. So that's the different. It doesn't look very different on the face of it, but because of the different flags we've got here and the fact that we can see the data is quite a lot later, we can tell that that is what she's done. She's gone dormant and then she's come back in January and carried on with her study. So now going to a part year dormancy. So again, a little bit like the resit thing. Matt, in this example, is going to start his study. In January, he's then going to go dormant for a term and isn't doing anything at the provider. And this is one of the providers that has a January starter. So he's then able to come back, start with that cohort of students instead, carry on and do years 2 and 3. So in terms of what his data looks like, he's starting off with a student course session. So he starts off and then goes dormancy. So again, Regent student course session 02 is interrupted. He then comes back later on and he's moved here. You can see on the session year, he's moved to the January cohort now. So we can tell he's missed the beginning bit again, because he's already done that up here in the student course session. And then he carries on with the January cohorts, and years 2 and 3 kind of match up as normal. So I've got one more slide to show you, and then I will take any questions. So what this is basically trying to show is the point around you can attach different students doing slightly different things to the same set of session years. So we've got A, B, C, and D here. It doesn't matter if they're a little bit later, they're just doing normal study patterns, whether they're doing, so Ruth was doing a placement year in here, or you could have a foundation year. It doesn't matter what they're doing in terms of their detail, it matters of when that year should have been. And so you can have all types of different students attached to the same session year bucket, depending on what's relevant. That's the key bit here. So I think, yes, I'm at the end of my slides. So I will obviously pause there for probably questions.
Okay, there are no questions at the moment, but I'll give everybody a moment of time. Just going back to the APAL question that came up earlier on, the final comment just said students do join late due to previous learning. It would be helpful if we had guidance, clear guidance on whether they can be included in the session year of the cohort they are joining partway through. So I've just taken that away, and we can discuss that offline and look to see whether that's something that goes into our guidance. Okay, just to check, if a provider has regular session years, so September start, January start, etc., which might apply to multiple courses, maths, chemistry, etc., are there any links, or are they considered completely separate?
If you mean in terms of can you attach a student doing a maths or chemistry or biology to the same session year, yes, you can. That's fine. Originally in our model, we had kind of the session years being linked to the course, but actually providers said that didn't really matter to them because they kind of they assign them all in this kind of bucket. So in this way, all of the people who start in September are on the same, they probably don't call it cohorts, but are in the same kind of bucket of students. So it doesn't matter what they're studying or what kind of specific student activity they're doing. It's it's the dates, it's when they start. So this being, you know, September. Obviously, there's a specific date. I've just picked September so that there wasn't too many dates on the screen. But you know, the 1st of September, if they all start then they're all linked to that same session year. That is fine.
Okay, well, thank you, Rachel and Ruth, for sharing that with us. As I say, we will make this video available. If you have any other questions, then please do feel free to contact either Rachel or Ruth directly if you have their contact details, or if you would like to come through to me at training@hesa.ac.uk, and I can pass it on to them and we will share that, get that resolved for you. Otherwise, thank you very much and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.